What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. It's pretty much confirmed at this point that Generation 10 will show up in 2026. This works out great for a number of reasons, because it will also be the 30th anniversary of Pokémon. Having a landmark year line up perfectly with a monumental shift in generations, finally gaining that double digit is brilliant, and it tracks seamlessly with the pattern of the games coming out every 3 years or so. However, given the trend of the last half of the franchise basically, Gen 10 will have some kind of battle gimmick to essentially define the region, as well as gameplay, and give it an immediately recognizable distinction from any other game. I mean, besides the general overall look of the game that can easily tell you where you are at a glance. However, the question is, what would this gimmick be? I mean, what could they even do? It would have to affect the battle system in some way, and there's really only so many methods that you could use. But since the new Legends game was kind enough to buy us some time, let's speculate on what Gen 10's gimmicks should be. Number 6. Armors. This notion has been a favorite of fan-made games for a while now, and it's easy to see why. Taking a regular Pokémon and cladding them in some cool armor is not only a nice striking visual element, but thematically fitting for buffing their stats as well, probably affecting defense the most, but it could still provide a hearty boost in attack. This could be a traditional medieval suit of armor like a knight, or maybe a more futuristic Tron-style look, or more likely a combination of some kind. Now, like most transformation gimmicks, this would have to be restricted, since they're not gonna make over 1,000 new models for every little base stage Pokemon to become armored, but a few choice options to turn Pokemon that really need it into better fighting machines would put an even bigger focus on the battling part of Pokemon. Now, it would likely be banned in competitive or whatever, but this is actually not a new concept for Pokemon, even if they have held it at arm's length. See, Mewtwo has been depicted in armor before, in the films, but also in some of the games like Pokémon Go. And then of course other Pokémon like the Charcadet evolutions give us a glimpse of how an armor system could significantly change the available weapons given the right power-up. Although I think it's safe to say that Urshifu would be one of the few candidates, because it got snubbed pretty hard by being the mascot for the Isle of Armor, yet not having any. Obviously, I don't think this is the most likely option, but getting your Pokemon to suit up like they're about to go fight crime is an attractive prospect to say the least, and armors could be just the thing to set the next generation apart. Number 5. Burst Evolution. This has nothing to do with the Pokken mechanic of a similar name, so I'll need to explain this one a little bit. But this is a sort of compromise of having a battle gimmick, but also going back to basics. See, instead of a cool new form change or a massive powerful attack, I'm envisioning these Pokemon could temporarily advance rapidly through its stages to reach the end once per battle. So basically, imagine that you throw out a Grookey and then you hit the button and it becomes a Rillaboom in battle, only to revert to its cute base stage once the encounter ends, just like Megas or Terastallizing. Speaking of, you would probably have to recharge it after every use like the Terra Orb, but it would probably have to give the Pokemon a predetermined moveset because it would be too difficult to extrapolate what moves it thinks you might want. Now, this obviously has some issues, like how some Pokemon don't evolve at all, so they would not be able to participate, but also, once the Pokemon does fully evolve, what happens then? Well, some Pokemon do have additional forms beyond their final evolution that could be used, but then that's just kind of the return of old gimmicks, I guess. But I just wanted the base stages to be able to get in on the action for once, and getting a sneak peek at what's to come when you might not expect it would be so much fun. Plus, that kind of balances the gimmick out, as it would be overpowered in the beginning of the game, but lose steam as you go on in your journey. Not the most equalized gimmick, but as I said, it could be an appropriate middle ground. But that's not nearly as unbalanced as... Number 4. All the gimmicks. Okay, this is the least likely option on the whole list. However, I think if they were ever gonna do it, which they won't, but if they were, the 10th generation seems like the perfect time. I mean, when else would it even be a big enough milestone to pull that card again? Generation 50? There would be multiple dozens of other gimmicks to cram into one game by that point, not to mention the fact that we would all be long gone. So why not let us see it now when it would be far easier to implement to only juggle a handful of them, even if it would still be quite difficult to thread that needle. You would have to strike a balance, but we have already seen Megas with Z moves in a Alola, so all we really need to do is add in Dynamaxing and Terastallizing and then we would be good. Now obviously you couldn't have them all active at once on the same Pokemon, like your Pikachu couldn't Gigantamax and then use its exclusive Z move, or have a Houndoom Mega Evolve and then Terastallize on top of that, but you can pick and choose depending on what item you equip on the Pokemon. So no, sadly Mega Rayquaza could not do everything in one turn. However, I don't see a problem with having one of each be used per battle across different party members, like how Ash did it in his champion tournament in the anime. And I guess maybe you could technically throw in the strong or agile styles from Legends Arceus as a gimmick too, albeit a much less intrusive one, but we've seen from the new Legends game that long-gone gimmicks can in fact return. So maybe a big celebration like the 10th generation in their 30th year is just the thing that could unite all the gimmicks and make us all feel as inevitable as Thanos. However, that is a lot, and I could understand them not wanting to do all of that work. In fact, number 3, no gimmick. It could be possible that they go the opposite way in commemorating the Pokemon series and purposefully endeavor to simplify the experience and return to the way things used to be in the early years just to focus on the standard gameplay. As much as it might hurt us all a little bit inside, we must remember that there are many children out there whose first Pokemon games will be the Gen 10 versions. So there may be no better time to recapture the spirit of the originals and let the new kids experience why the rest of us fell in love with Pokemon in the first place. You could argue that might be a little too boring for longtime fans or for those with short attention spans, but just because there's no big defining hook doesn't mean the battle system has to remain untouched. Each generation introduced more subtle additions like weather conditions to the battle system, or later on abilities or the physical special split. So who's to say that we couldn't see some sort of small alterations to the basic formula and evoke the classic Pokemon journey without overwhelming newcomers, while also reminding the veterans of a simpler time. And hey, maybe they could even build in a graphics toggle switch to have it look like the older sprite-based games whenever you want. That alone might make it fly off the shelves, and no need to include a gimmick at all, just good old-fashioned Pokemon fun. Number 2, Pokemon Fusions. I'm not sold that this would ever happen on a large scale, but we were nearly there once, kind of. Before Sun and Moon came out, people were speculating that the Z crystals were the things that cause fusions in the manga, the burst hearts, but alas they were nowhere close. So Pokemon has skirted the line with fusions in the past in other media, but even in the games themselves with certain legendary trios, like either Kyurem fusing with Zekrom or Reshiram, or Necrozma doing the same with Solgaleo and Lunala. There's also Beldum fusing together, but that's not really a gameplay mechanic. However, Zygarde would count more towards that kind of fusion, even though it's just fusing with itself. And we also have the Galar fossils as fusions of Pokemon that we have never seen before. Even Calyrex kind of counts. It's not exactly a traditional fusing of their total forms, but whichever horse Pokemon you choose will still be consumed only to create a single entity. Now, like I said, Pokemon fusions seem less likely than anything, certainly not letting every Pokemon do it, because that would necessitate creating over 1,000 new forms for every Pokemon, jamming up the roster to suddenly have 1,000,000 new forms in one game. So we would have to narrow it down to just ones that we really want, likely just some of the fan favorites, or we could borrow Calyrex's style of fusing and just throw 2 Pokemon together with them basically standing next to each other, but only taking up 1 slot. I'm still not a huge fan of consuming one of the Pokemon in the process, but boosting stats and swapping around moves would be a pretty fun way to jumble things up. And double battles would get pretty crazy when every Pokemon is a random Ice Climber style pairing. That would make it a lot easier, almost more like Tatsugiri's ability instead, and I still don't think fusions are likely to go all the way in the mainline games at all, but come on, when would there be a better time to implement it in the series than the revolutionary Gen 10? Number 1, Shadow Pokemon. Honestly, I could see the quote-unquote gimmick of the 10th generation being new types in general. They could add in 2 new ones to round it out to 20 types even in the games. Pretty fitting for a big anniversary like that. But barring that from happening, I think they could implement Shadow Pokemon as a mechanic instead. As it happens, Shadow Pokemon might just be the most pervasive hypothetical on this list, having been seen quite prominently in the GameCube era with Colosseum and Gale of Darkness being a core mechanic of those games, but also showing showing up more recently within Pokemon Go for a while, and of course even Shadow Mewtwo in Pokken Tournament. This makes it a huge pattern that has somehow never appeared in the main series of Pokemon. Probably the biggest one, and even better, it's a reference to those outlier materials and classic side games that people have lots of nostalgia for. So it would be the perfect thing to include in the core series of games at a critical moment when they're looking to celebrate their legacy while also building a foundation for the next 30 years. Obviously, most gimmicks only stick around for one generation, and I feel like Shadow Pokemon strikes that balance of being exciting, but also not devastating to leave once we move on. So then we just need to worry about the logistics of the gameplay, but they have been fairly consistent across their iterations, with the wild Shadow Pokemon showing up looking all evil and then you can purify them later. The question comes up, I guess, on whether they would stick with the initial setup of Shadow moves hitting everything neutrally, or go with the XD route of it being super effective on everything else, or just crafting an entirely separate system of matchups. But if you're putting in all that effort, you might as well add in a couple of new official types, of course making sure to distinguish it well enough from Dark or Ghost, but it doesn't even need all of that if it's going to be a mechanic outside of the type system. Shadow Pokemon are just screaming to be included in the plot of the evil team in some way. Maybe they're trying to force Pokemon to evolve like Team Rocket did, resulting in a shadow virus that you have to cleanse through every major story beat. And even being connected to the legendary of the region, like how other gimmicks have had narrative reasons for being specific to those locations. So a thematically fitting gimmick that's easy to implement, and once again conjures up a long-used link to the series' past, makes me think that Shadow Pokemon would be the perfect thing to roll out for the 30th anniversary and Gen 10 of Pokemon. But of course, they're a lot more likely to pull something wild out of thin air that we would never expect. But what gimmick do you think should be implemented in the 10th generation? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.